Hey, hi everybody, and welcome to the second session of Navigating the Pandemic. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're just joining us for the first time now. I'm Peter Levine. I'm from the Tisch College of Civic Life, and I'm kind of opening us up today, but we'll have many other speakers. A couple of practical matters. We're using the Q&A feature to collect your questions. So while speakers are talking, please use the Q&A feature to put questions in there. We'll be monitoring those questions and make sure that the speakers have a chance to answer at least some of them. We're also going to use the chat function, but only sometimes, so as not to have a constant flow of chat that will be distracting. We're going to switch it on sometimes. So it's on right now, and actually I would like to ask you to use it. So while I'm just finishing up my intros, please type in the chat function what's on your mind as you start today's session. Just type some words, what's on your mind as you start today's session. And you can actually weigh in more than once. So you can have several things on your mind. So love to see some stream of thoughts as we begin today. Meanwhile, I'll say thank you very much for the survey that for completing the survey we sent out last week. We looked at it really carefully. A lot of people called for more interactivity, which was very helpful. We're happy to try to do more of that. So in particular, we are starting today a breakout discussion session. So from 12:30 to 1 o'clock today, you can join breakout discussions that follow today's session and have a chance to talk with your colleagues, fellow students. 12:30 to 1, the link to that Zoom is on Canvas. It's a separate link. And it's completely optional. It's not required for getting the certificate or anything, but we hope you'll consider joining. Today's session, we're focusing, the broad theme is kind of inclusivity, bias, and bridging differences during the pandemic, and also mindfulness as a strategy for stress reduction. So we've got, just to give you a broad overview, we have some guest speakers, Eboo Patel, who I'll introduce in a minute, Tufts faculty, Tufts professors Keith Maddox, Sam Sommers, and Kerry Modri Mandel, and Tufts grad student Jessie Samadhi. And so we're grateful for all of them for joining us. Just before now I turn it over to Eboo, let me say a few words about him. Eboo Patel is a friend of mine, an admired friend, and a friend of Tufts, who's been on our campus a number of times and been very supportive of our work. He's the president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, which you should check out, and which I'm sure he will talk about a little bit. He has a doctorate in sociology of religion from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He's been an activist, a leader, a public intellectual, founding and leading a bunch of things. He's written, I think, 7 books, including an autobiography, Acts of Faith. I prefer Eboo to define his own work, but I see him as working at the intersection of diversity, especially diversity of faith, and kind of service and civic engagement and social change. And he's really deeply involved in building a movement for interfaith cooperation and interfaith life. So with that, Eboo, I'll turn it over to you, and but I'll pop back up again in about 20 minutes to ask you questions that the students have posed to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Can folks hear me? Just kind of say hi in the chat or raise your hands or whatever you do. I just want to make sure folks can hear me okay. Great. Thank you so much. So if we could just go to my first slide, can this crisis make us more inclusive? I'd appreciate that. So as we get that up, you know, what I want to say is we're experiencing in the United States 2 once-in-a-half-century I don't know if I want to call them crises. I mean, clearly the pandemic is a crisis. The George Floyd murder is just absolute brutality, and the protests are a remarkable opportunity. And we're experiencing 2 of these things, 2 things that happen like once in a half century at the exact same time. And so I want to show you the line that I began my talks with about a month ago. And part of the, so it's the next slide. So part of the reason I want to show this to you is, so I want to kind of raise the question, how relevant is this concern? Is this deeply relevant? Is this the first thing that's on your mind when you wake up in the morning? It's the first thing that was on my mind when I woke up in the morning, I would say mid-April to mid-May. So it's from my friend Robert Jones. It's a piece that he did called Flattening the Curve of Xenophobia, where there is a massive wave of suffering and death. A second wave of racism and xenophobia is not far behind. An 1832 cholera epidemic in New York was blamed on Irish Catholic immigrants, and outbreaks of smallpox in San Francisco blamed on the Chinese population. All kinds of things, of course, have been blamed on African Americans, and many, many, many of these things lead to extremely violent waves of racism and murders and deaths. And as the term Chinese virus made its way through the American lexicon, starting unbelievably from the White House, and their Asian Americans and others were targeted, it was a deep concern of mine. In addition to the way that this disease took root, especially in poorer Black and Brown communities, because they are essential workers and they show up to work, right? The Amazon deliveries keep getting made in my neighborhood, including to my house. The Whole Foods at my house is no longer 80% white. It's now 80% Black and Latino. Why? Because people like me with my means aren't going to the grocery store. We're sending poor Black and Latino folks. And we're paying a little extra. And we know we're sending these people into disease-ridden areas, right? So in addition to the toll the actual disease takes, was there going to be a pandemic of racism that followed, of violent racism? So I'm watching out for this in all kinds of ways, right? And then, of course, the unbelievable happens, right? Hope in history rhymes, in the phrase of the great Irish poet. And we have this massive movement that's been building for 10 years plus 390, okay? Where in response to this unbelievably brutal murder of an African-American man, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the knee of a taxpayer-paid uniformed law enforcement officer watched by 3 of his colleagues and a street full of people, an 8-minute and 40-second video taken by a 17-year-old girl who knew that something was wrong from the jump, changes everything. It is as good of an example, I'm gonna be super geeky here, of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of a Scientific Revolution as I've ever seen in my life, right? All of a sudden, it's the last piece of evidence and the paradigm totally shifts. And people are like, this whole thing is crazy. Not just this incident, but the whole thing. The whole thing is crazy. The way policing works, the way the economy works, the way that social stratification works, right? And we see, I'm citing a New York Times piece here that you guys can Google, or maybe somebody smart and more technologically savvy than me can put in the chat box. But the title is How Public Opinion Has Moved on Black Lives Matter, published not very long ago. And it's stunning, right? Like you have like 30, 40 point jumps in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was very controversial not 2 or 3 months ago, right? You have 30, 40 point jumps in favor of it. And it's literally by every education level, every racial group, every age group, and across political parties, right? I mean, for me, you know, in my, I don't know, 30, 25 years of like paying attention to social change and social movements, I personally have never seen anything like this. And part of what I want to realize is that this isn't a comet that just like hits from the sky. This is a movement that has prepared for this moment. And that movement was unafraid, and they expanded the social space day by day, book by book, protest by protest, question by question. And then the rest of us saw it. The rest of us saw it, right? So the context has changed. And one of the things that I want to pay attention to, one of the things that I have done in my own personal reflection is realize just how much Interfaith Youth Corps, the organization that I lead, comes out of racial justice movements. Frankly, it's something that I have paid a lot less attention to in the last 10 years of my work as president of Interfaith Youth Corps. It was much, much more salient in the first 10 years. And, there's it's some exploration to be doing there. Why is it that I found an organization based on the inspiring interfaith cooperation that I learn about in racial justice movements and then lose that thread in the last 10 years? It is no longer as centered as it was in the first 10 years. So I say that as a way of personal reflection. I wonder who else that might be true for, right? Who else might that be true for? So what I want to do in the next few minutes is just to share a couple of those movements that inspired the creation of Interfaith Youth Corps and the interfaith dimension to them. And the reason that Interfaith Youth Corps exists is because I was so inspired by the untold story of interfaith cooperation in racial justice movements. I thought it deserved an organization. And when I was 24, 25 years old, I was crazy enough to start it. And here I am 20 years later, frankly, at this point, wishing I was a little crazier, wishing that I had that same craziness and courage in the last few years that I did in the first years of IFYC. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at some of these interfaith movements. So this is one of the marches from Selma to Montgomery. There were actually several marches, right? This is probably the most iconic picture of that march. And there, of course, is Dr. King right at the center. And the person with the bushy white beard is the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And a couple people over on the other side that's, I believe, a Catholic sister there. And I remember somebody mentioning to me, we know a lot about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but not a whole lot about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And that was kind of my first exploration to, wait a second, like King wasn't just a brilliant PhD, by the way, from Boston University, not far from where you are. But he was also a Christian minister. So what did that mean to him? And one of the things that I found in King's writing was, many people want to make of me many things, but in the deep recesses of my heart, I'm the son of a Baptist minister. I'm the grandson of a Baptist minister, and I'm the great-grandson of a Baptist minister. And my commitment to Jesus as the Son of the living God is the highest commitment that I have. And if you watch the film Selma, it is so obvious, the great film by Ava DuVernay, it's so obvious the role that religious conviction plays in inspiring King, in giving him a big vision, and in offering him solace. So when he feels just like despondent one night, he calls Mahalia Jackson and says, I need to hear the voice of the Lord. And when he's on the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and he's faced by all of these policemen with their billy clubs, and he doesn't know what to do for a moment, he kneels and he prays, right? And by the way, it's not just King's Christianity that is a part of the civil rights movement. So there's Abraham Joshua Heschel, who says the soul of Judaism is at stake in the civil rights movement. He comes to see King speak at the Chicago Conference on Religion and Race in 1963, and he decides, this man who barely survived the Holocaust, he decides that if he doesn't get involved in the civil rights movement, he is failing his religion. There's a lot of other people, a lot of other interfaith threads to civil rights movement. Of course, King is deeply influenced by Gandhi, right? Everybody knows that. But one of the stories of that strikes me the most is when King goes to India in 1959, And he sees that Gandhi's movement is an interfaith movement. It's not just a Hindu movement, and that actually Gandhi is deeply influenced by Jainism. That's where he gets his conviction towards nonviolence. Ahimsa is what it's called. Gandhi has positive things to say about the Baha'i faith. Gandhi has read the Sermon on the Mount and Leo Tolstoy and is deeply influenced by those things. King comes back to Montgomery, Alabama, and on Palm Sunday, 1959, he gives a sermon. The second to last line is this: "O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we call you this name. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you Jehovah. We know some call you the unmoved mover." Right? So you get this sense of like King's like deep Christian roots, but also his wings, his capaciousness. The only person King ever recommends for the Nobel Peace Prize, nominates, is the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist monk from Vietnam, who writes to King and says, "We Vietnamese Buddhists regard you as a bodhisattva, one who has attained enlightenment and chosen to stay on earth to teach compassion to others. Does your compassion not extend to those of us suffering from the war of your government in Vietnam?" Right? So there's all these interfaith threads in the civil rights movement. And again, back when I was in my late teens and early 20s and just like exploring this, my first thought was, how come I haven't been told about this? And number two, how inspiring is this and where is it now? Right, so let's go to the next slide. So this, of course, is Nelson Mandela doing a dua, a Muslim prayer with a set of Muslims. And one of the things that I learned as part of like my personal journey is just how deeply the struggle in South Africa was an interfaith movement. And so during the time I was a PhD student at Oxford, I took a couple months off and I spent those months in South Africa. It was December of 1999 to February of 2000. And I saw Mandela speak. And the first words out of his mouth, this was at an interfaith conference, so it was kind of apropos to the topic, but he points to the Cape in the direction of Robben Island, where he spent, over a quarter century in prison. And he says, "I would still be there if it wasn't for the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, the African traditionalists, the Jews, the secular humanists, the Quakers." It goes down this list of religious communities. And then he says, working together in the struggle against apartheid. And I have this like, scales falling from my eyes moment, which is like, holy cow. The greatest liberation movement of my time, the struggle against apartheid, right? I was 23 or 24 at the time. So this had happened during my lifetime. Mandela had been freed and elected leader of South Africa. It was an interfaith movement. Here's the person who was both the symbol and the leader of that movement saying this was an interfaith movement that freed me, right? And I was just kind of connecting to my own tradition of Islam at the time. And one of the things that blew me away, I grew up in a household where my parents, in Indian Ismaili Muslim immigrant household, where I basically thought people who looked like me and people who had the life patterns of my parents, we became professionals. That's what we did, right? And effectively, it was almost like Quranic. It was almost like the religion says you gotta get a professional degree and start a company or be an accountant or be a doctor or something, right? And I'm meeting cats in South Africa like Farid Essak, Rashid Omar, Ibrahim Rasool, Ibrahim Musa, and these guys were like central in the interfaith movement in South Africa, in the struggle against apartheid. They literally putting their lives on the line, and they're like articulating a Muslim theology of cooperation and liberation. And I'm blown away by this, right? By the way, part of the challenge, of course, is that the struggle against apartheid is a movement of men and women and people of all sexualities and gender queers, but often when it's pictured like this, it is just men. That is a problem. And I put this picture up deliberately to say, this is not fully accurate. This does not account for the women who are involved, the queers involved, the people from all different walks of life involved, right? And that is part of the challenge with faith work, is that there's a patriarchal dimension to it. And we just have to be honest about that. And as we move forward in this, it has to change. Next slide. So this is, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, and the gentleman. Again, like there's a patriarchal dimension to this picture also, right? There's the women in the back, and I promise you, they're not just in the back of the movement. They're doing a lot more than that. But this is the way that unfortunately religious traditions have often worked, or at least it's how they present themselves, right? That is a problem, and that has to change going forward. So there's Gandhi, and the man in front of him is Jawaharlal Nehru, who of course is not only a Gandhian protege, but it's the first prime minister of India. So one of the interesting things about Nehru is that he is not a religious man. He's a very proud secular humanist, right? So it's interesting, of course, because Gandhi is a deeply religious man. Obviously, his anchor is in Hinduism, but as I said before, he is nurtured by a range of faiths. Actually, one of my favorite quotes from Gandhi is your house, you should have your own religious house, but the window should be open to let in the warm breezes from other religions, right? Like, learn from these. And it is just very important to note that Gandhi's most important political protege is a secular humanist, Jawaharlal Nehru. And the gentleman behind Gandhi is Badsha Khan, okay? A Pashtun, which is a particular tribe in Afghanistan. Interestingly enough, it's the same tribe that the Taliban comes from. And he is known as the Frontier Gandhi. He is a deeply committed Muslim pacifist who is by Gandhi's side in all kinds of parts of the movement. Hind Swaraj is an interfaith movement. Last slide. That is my first faith hero. That's Dorothy Day. It's a very apropos photo of this moment. Dorothy Day starts the Catholic worker movement when she is in her early 30s. In 1933, it's a way to intertwine her deep Catholicism and her commitment to a radical and just economic and racial order. She is opposed to violence in all of its forms. She always showed up. And I love this image because there is this sense of calm and serenity and conviction. And she's like 80 years old here, right? And she's like, we are leading towards a beloved community, and why don't you come with us? And it was Dorothy Day that I discovered. Somebody told me about her work when I was 19 or 20 years old and an angry activist. And it was her approach to building the beloved community that became central to how I wanted to approach this work, and was my first foray into faith as a deep well for the work of social action and social justice, and therefore my first steps on the path of how important interfaith work was to these kinds of movements. I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Eboo. By the way, I think if I remember correctly, you actually started experiments in communal living with Dorothy Day as the inspiration. Is that right?
That's right. I helped to start a community in Chicago called Stone Soup, which the Chicago Reader once described as a place full of hippies smelling strongly of lentils.
Yep. I can almost remember it, even though I wasn't there. So we have some, and I also wanted to say a bunch of the students, although a minority because there's a lot of students on this call, but a bunch of them took my course on Martin Luther King last semester, and I tried to highlight his theology and his interfaith work quite a bit. Although I didn't know the quote in which he invokes the other names of God. That's fabulous. So we do have some questions that came in. Mostly anybody who wants to put a question in the Q&A button should do so now, but we did also anyway have some questions from before that were sent to us before the day began. And there's a cluster of them that are about how you talk to people across deep divides. So one person said, when you advocate for your community, how do you start the conversation with people outside your community in a way that doesn't make the people in power feel threatened or defensive while still addressing the root cause of the issue? And I might lump that together with a related question, which is, when America is so divided, how do we reach out to the other side and create connection and understanding? So yeah, you have thoughts on those?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things here. I found a framework by Deepa Iyer very useful recently. It's the Ecology of Social Change framework. My friend and colleague Jen Bailey, who's a Tufts grad, told me about it recently. And it's, you guys can, maybe somebody can put it in the chat box, but it's the different roles and kind of types that are involved in social change. And the disruptor and the frontline responder is one type. And the truth is that is not who I am. It's not who I am personality wise, right? And I stand in awe of those people because, because I lead kind of a professional organization and I go to college campuses, including Tufts several times, and I speak, and every once in a while I'll get disrupted. I'm not crazy about that. And I realize that what those folks are doing is, excuse my French, they're calling bullshit on the whole system, right? And they're saying you can't just move the furniture around. This whole thing needs to change. And part of what's happened in the last 4 weeks is that mode of social change won. The whole space has changed. The whole space has changed, right? When Jeff Bezos is posting emails that he is having with customers saying, I'm not taking Black Lives Matter down. And by the way, you're a customer I'm happy to lose. And the 30% of America who doesn't like it, I'm happy to lose. Now, there's a strategic part of this, but there's an ethical part also, right? When Michael Jordan, who once said, who wouldn't be public about his views on the Senate race involving Jesse Helms in the 1980s or 1990s, one of the most famous racists of the last 50 years, when he's like, Black Lives Matter, I'm giving $100 million. That's not a controversial statement. The people who did the disruptive work won. And I am in awe and grateful. And that's not me. It's not me, right? I'm a bridge builder. I do other things. My personality type leads in other ways. My temperament leads in other ways. My life stage, I'm 44 with 2 kids and a mortgage, leads in other ways. I'm just not who I am. And I think about, there's this beautiful moment that I saw Cornel West on Book TV, I don't know, like 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. And I'm just kind of like randomly flipping channels, and there's Dr. West. So, you stop and pay attention when that happens, right? So somebody calls in and says, Dr. West, I think I disagree with you on everything politically, but I'm a jazz fan, and I know you're a jazz fan too. So I want to talk about Charles Mingus and John Coltrane and Miles Davis with you. And Cornel West says, yes, brother, let's talk that. Let's talk jazz. Let's talk jazz, right? And that was just so striking to me, right? And again, it's like a fleeting 2 minutes that happened 12 years ago, right? But Cornel West's instinct, like it was instinctive. It wasn't just strategic. It was instinctive. Was let's start the conversation where we have not just agree, but we have like a visceral connection. You love John Coltrane. I love John Coltrane. It's a visceral connection. Let's start it there, right? That's a lot more who I am.
So, Eboo, we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to, instead of giving you much chance to respond, I'll give you the last word. But I want to put a few questions out for everybody to think about, because they're coming in the Q&A. So instead of directing them at you so much, I wanted to direct them back at everybody. So, you invoked 2 really classic theorists and practitioners of nonviolence, Gandhi and King. And Jainism and other things that are about nonviolence. We have a question about how peace has never been achieved peacefully, and how violence is sometimes necessary, which is certainly a good discussion opener. I think you posed a question about what lane people want to drive in. So it might be that you need lots of different kinds of people to make change, but one kind of person you need is a bridge builder, and another kind of person is a disruptor. And so I think students could be thinking about what kind of person they want to be or are. And then my own student, Sarah Wiener, asks, is the spiritual element necessary for sustainable civic engagement? Or could there be a source of hope that could also be secular? If not from religion, where does that hope come from, and how can we cultivate it? So we actually have to move on to our other speakers. I wonder if you can I give you 25 seconds for
yes. I'm going to just leave you with this. Those are all excellent questions. You just like in the Quran or in Aristotle, you will find evidence for any point of view. the power of violence, the power of nonviolence, the power of spirituality to sustain social action, the power of secularism to sustain it. Whatever view you want to find evidence for, I promise you'll find evidence for it, right? So that's just an interesting thing to note. And I will leave you with this line that for whatever reason has been playing in my system that I just find just very moving. William Blake said, "We are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love." We are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love.
Thank you. That's a great way to end. But
Thank you, friend.
not the end of our relationship. We everybody should go to Interfaith Youth Corps, check out the website, and we're going to keep bugging Eboo to be part of the Tufts community, whether he likes it.
I love it. By the way, we just launched a new online platform called Interfaith America. So if you Google IFYC Interfaith America, you can check out our work there.
Excellent. Good.
Thanks, friends.
Thank you, Eboo. And now, I'm going to help us make the transition to the next segment, which is with two of our really esteemed and admired colleagues, multidimensional members of our faculty who are in global demand for their work together, although they also work separately. And so we're particularly grateful that they're willing to give this time to the Tufts community. Dr. Keith Maddox is Associate Professor of Psychology and directs the Social Cognition Lab at Tufts, a lab which is funded with impressive grants and does immense amount of works, a lot on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. For example, how people cognitively represent and stereotype African Americans based on variation in skin color. That would just be an example. Dr. Sam Sommers is Professor of Psychology at Tufts, an experimental social psychologist, also interested in issues related to stereotyping, prejudice, and group diversity. Sam has written 2 books for general audiences, which means people like me, Situations Matter and This Is Your Brain on Sports, and has won teaching awards, including being elected or named Teacher of the Year by the Student Senate. So they do research separately, but often present together, and I think that's what they're going to do now. So I'm going to turn it over to these experienced and talented educators and get out of the way, but I'll be back in about 25 minutes or 20 minutes, 25 minutes, somewhere in there, with relaying some questions to you. We got a bunch of very interesting questions for you in advance from students, and then others will come in the Q&A. So thank you to both of you.
That sounds good. Thank you, Peter. Good morning, Keith.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you.
So Keith and I were talking this morning about how we would proceed, and we flipped a coin, and I'm gonna start. I drew the blue polo coin, and you got the red polo shirt, and then we thought that I would start, and basically just start by giving a little context. When we were first approached and asked to participate in this endeavor, we thought we were going to focus exclusively on issues related to racism and intergroup relations and disparity and bias as they relate to the current COVID-19 crisis. As you heard, and we'll maybe introduce ourselves a little bit as well, though Peter did such a good job, I'm not sure we have to do that. But both Keith and I are experimental social psychologists who study issues related to stereotyping and bias and intergroup relations and the like. We thought we'd be talking about issues like how the COVID-19 crisis is one that is disproportionately affecting Black and Native communities in the United States. We thought we would be talking about the ways in which there has been a spike in anti-Asian sentiment and action in this country, especially during the early stages of the COVID-19 virus. We heard from our previous presenter about the ways in which both race and ethnicity and nationality and socioeconomic status intersect in interesting but concerning ways with regard to our reactions to this crisis, just the financial consequences of the lockdown, the idea that it is the demographics. I believe the example we heard, which is I think a poignant example, the demographics of your local Whole Foods have changed over the last several months as you have people ordering online and sending paid workers in to do that shopping for them, and so forth. And so all of those are going to be our focus, and those are still issues I think that we are going to talk through. But it is obviously in the last couple of weeks also become clear. It has always been clear, but just really acutely, achingly, saliently clear that we are also in a pandemic of racism in this country. And there are a lot of ways that we can talk about that. And of course, a lot of that discussion and protest derives from the recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and unfortunately many others, and the protests and the movements that have grown out of that. And so that is all the context with which we appear here with you this morning. And I thought I would start by just sort of recognizing that and centering us in that context, and then basically saying to my colleague who I have not seen in person in quite a long time, how are you doing during all of this? How are we? I mean, with all of that's going on in our personal lives and in society at large, sort of what are your reflections and thoughts, and where are you emotionally, psychologically right now, friend and colleague?
Yeah, well, I will say, and I'm probably not very different from a lot of other people, that, it's been a roller coaster. There have been moments that I've been, incredibly sort of downtrodden and depressed with respect to the outlook for our country. But then there are also moments where I'm hopeful, cautiously optimistic about the future and the potential for change. So it's been a wild ride to some extent, and I'm doing okay now. Exactly, I'm in a moment now where I'm able to sort of process and talk about this. But what I found is that like the conversation that we're about to have, talking about it has been useful. It's been helpful. It's helped me to think a little bit around sort of what my role would be in contributing to what is this hopefully sustained effort to uproot some of the more systematic elements of racism, not just in policing, but in a lot of different domains in our society. But at the same time, again, that question of sustainability and trying to figure out, what can we do, who can do what, how do we keep it going, how do we maintain momentum, momentum past, what might be elections in November, where people might think of as a natural stopping point that we've won, that we have some success. And I'm still in doubt about the outcome of that election, to be perfectly honest. I think that's sort of the defensiveness, the pessimism in me to some extent. But again, beyond that, there's going to be more work. There's going to be sustained effort that's going to be required. And it's going to ask each of us to look at ourselves, look at our situations, and make some decisions about how badly we want this type of change, how passionately we want to argue for or fight for, as Mr. Patel said, in our own ways, in our own lanes, for racial justice, racial equality, and how long we're able to do that. And so I've really been starting to think a bit more about trying to figure out ways to make efforts that are going to be a lot more sustainable over time, and also pushing myself out of my typical comfort zone. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's been challenging. So how are you feeling, Sam?
It turns dejected and hopeless and guilty and frustrated, and thinking through all the things that you're talking about. Keith, you and I are we're empirical scientists. We conduct research, and we publish for the most part in academic journals. And so thinking through all of that, there's a part of me that has always sort of thought, well, that is making a contribution to combating racism, to anti-racism. That is making a contribution to fostering equity and goals related to diversity and inclusion. But I'll be honest, I mean, is it? And I do sort of wonder. And we all have our own lanes, as we've been talking about. But I mean, you and I teach dozens, sometimes hundreds of undergraduate students at Tufts in our psychology courses, and those are sometimes courses explicitly with a focus on. You have a course on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, for example. And we both teach social psychology in our respective semesters. We focus at least part of the course on those kinds of issues. But we're spending a lot of time in our research and in our conversations thinking about the mechanisms underlying those processes. Why stereotypes, for example, are in many respects natural offshoots of the natural categorization processes that we use and the mental architecture we use to make sense of the world around us on a regular basis. I do. Do you worry at all? Are you concerned at all that what we do when we talk about those issues is at some level normalize those processes and ratchet us back from a state of alert and emergency and sort of suggest, well, this is going to be, again, a sort of a normal traditional offshoot of the way that we think and the way we process. Is there any portion of you that's concerned that what we're doing is not giving people carte blanche or license to engage in the world in a biased manner, but taking our foot off the accelerator and telling people, well, this is human nature and this is the way that we think?
Yeah, it's so honestly, that's probably troubled me, ever since we even started doing any of this kind of work in terms of, for those who don't know, we focused a lot on trying to understand different forms of bias and how they play out in our interpersonal relationships with other people, but then how you can imagine that our interpersonal relationships, the ways in which we treat, act, speak to, decide to allocate resources to, promote, fund, etc., how those things play out at an interpersonal level can blossom and bloom into, larger sort of intergroup disparities. And we, as social psychologists, ironically, recognize that this kind of bias, implicit, explicit bias, what have you, can play a role in people's outcomes. But we also know that situations make a difference. Situations matter, and structures are situations. Organizational processes and procedures are situations. And we don't spend a lot of time studying those kinds of things, even though we do acknowledge in a lot of our work that they're important, that they need to be addressed. And we also try to make some recommendations about how to go about addressing them. But I think the point you were bringing up, just this idea that our focus on this interpersonal idea of bias and prejudice, and specifically implicit bias and implicit prejudice, and how that often gets overemphasized in terms of trying to understand and explain some of the disparities that we see in our society. But I do think, and I think where I sort of land is that it's still important to have and understand that perspective. I think an implicit bias perspective is not one that sort of, as you sort of mentioned, it's true that at least from that perspective, there are lots of things about the way people are wired that makes stereotyping and prejudice a little bit more likely to happen, a little bit more natural, a little bit more automatic, and that it takes a lot of sort of effort and thought that we often don't have the opportunity to commit to our judgments in order to short circuit that and to derail it. So it's not that it's not important, and it's not that because it's something that's natural, it necessarily excuses us from being able to do anything about it. When I say natural, I just mean that and as you know, it's that our cognitive system is looking for shortcuts. We have lots of different things in our environments that limit our ability to process information carefully, and that the shortcuts of stereotypes that we have about people who belong to particular groups based on their appearance, based on other types of cues of their affiliation, those shortcuts are more likely to be taken than not. And that doesn't let us off the hook. What it does is it allows us to recognize that if we understand a little bit more about the process and the mechanism, that we can then sort of hack the system to try to come up with ways to, if not change how we make judgments, to at least mitigate the impact of those judgments. And I think that brings us back to that idea of systemic change, of organizational change, that if we can try to understand the role that different contextual processes play in organizations that we play in, thinking about climate, thinking about inclusion, those kinds of ways or systems, and the ways in which racial bias and other types of biases are sort of baked into the way we do things, baked into the status quo. If we can start to really re-examine those and start to make changes that are going to help to mitigate the impact of bias on individuals from different groups, then I think that there's still a value in trying to get people to recognize that they play a role in this. But if they don't do something about that role, then maybe there is something to the, sort of the adage that, you're kind of a bad apple. If you recognize that bias is playing a role in the outcomes of other people, even if it is something that's sort of natural, if you don't do anything about it, you may just, in fact, be a bad person.
Well, so, I mean, that makes me think about, and this is a conversation you and I have had many times over many years now, as we've worked together and I mean, been friends for a long time now, which how do you see, we're scientists, but nonetheless, how do you see our identities, our own personal sense of who we are, as playing a role in these kinds of conversations? I mean, I'll just give you the example, and we've alluded to this, but to say it explicitly, Keith and I have given workshops for a variety of different constituencies on campus and also across campus and off campus, but with HR and with IT and with the faculty and with incoming students and with the Tufts police, in which we talk about issues of bias and the psychology underlying all of that. It has never been lost upon us that we do that as an interracial pair, that we're doing that as a white man and a black man. We didn't necessarily choose those roles; we were born into them, but it has worked. We have talked about this, that there's some benefit to doing these kinds of exercises that way, because of both the experiences and personal experiences that we bring to bear, but also because of the way that we are going to be seen by other people just as soon as we walk in the room. So to what degree do you feel like those kinds of questions of identity and who we are and our own group memberships and our own affiliations play a role in shape the lanes that we should be in, and what we can and can't do and what we should and shouldn't be doing? We don't often talk and think in these terms because we're scientists and we try to publish data in empirical journals, but the work that you and I have done on this campus and elsewhere has I think forced us to confront it in a way that maybe some people in our scientific field don't necessarily do on a regular basis. What are your thoughts about how all those issues play out as we try to think about what our lanes are and how we move forward with the current scenarios?
Yeah, I think, so, I mean, I think identity is really important, right? And sort of understanding, there's a kind of a framework, and some of the work that I've done is sort of looking at, when you're attempting to confront bias in some way, it's really useful to sort of think about it as a persuasive communication, right? So the idea is that a persuasive communication, in terms of a lot of social psychology, has thought about this idea that you want to pay attention to not just sort of the message that you're trying to transmit, but you also want to consider two other factors. Consider the message and the framing of that message, but also consider the audience who you're going to be directing the message to, and then also consider the messenger. And a lot of times the messenger and the audience can be really, really impactful, because some messengers are going to be more accepted by some audiences compared to others. And so, again, some of the things that we've talked about is that when you have a group of individuals who are from across different racial and ethnic backgrounds who see a black and a white man sort of confronting bias together, to basically coming together with a similar message to try to get people on board with trying to get engaged with changing their organizations to be consistent with anti-racism. The idea is that there are going to be different people in the audience that are going to respond differently to each of us, right? That there are going to be some people in the audience, people who may look at me as a black man and think that I'm making these claims about racism as a way of trying to explain away some of the failings or some of the lack of success that I may have had in society. And that way of explaining those things away is thought of as being complaining. And really, I'm just trying to complain, and they might dismiss the message that I might convey to them. So if people think that I'm only explaining these things or talking about these things or confronting as a way of trying to benefit my own personal outcomes in terms of how I see myself or in terms of advancing myself in society, they're going to show a lot of backlash towards that and not listen to my message. But the same people in the audience might hear the same message from you and not necessarily make the same conclusion. Because again, as a white man in our society, for the most part, when you make claims about the role that bias plays in the outcomes of underrepresented groups and some of the solutions that we suggest to try to ameliorate that bias, you're arguing against your own interests in some way. So it's not as easy for people to dismiss you from that perspective. But I think there's also challenges on the other side, that there may be some people, particularly people who are activists or people who are Black and activists in our community, might look at a white man making these kinds of claims and still elicit some kind of backlash towards that person. Because, again, they might question your motivations. Are you doing this to get paid? Are you doing this to signal that you're, one of the good ones, so to speak? And so there may be some people in the audience that might think that you are doing something in terms of confrontation to amplify your own voice, and sometimes at the expense of other voices, of minority voices who have been basically conveying this message for years and years and years without anybody necessarily listening. So then those same individuals may look at me, and again, as we work together, don't necessarily question your motives as much, because they don't necessarily see my motives as being the same. Again, I am a voice ostensibly, at least phenotypically, sort of representative of the Black community, and that voice being considered and heard in a particular context is going to be validating for them, and not necessarily as threatening as it might be to sort of always hear Black voices, but never have them, for example, be heard, never have them be listened to or respected. And again, I think for people who are from underrepresented groups, knowing that that the kinds of claims that you've been making for years and years are being heard from you and not necessarily having to come from another source is incredibly validating. So that's a long answer, but yeah, I think our identities are incredibly important. And for anybody else out there, considering your identity is important. Who you are, what you're good at, as Mr. Patel sort of mentioned, trying to understand your temperament, trying to understand your skill sets, and trying to find a way to push yourself in ways that may be a little bit less comfortable, but still consistent with how you are and what you do well, so that you can create sustainable efforts towards anti-racist efforts.
Yeah, I mean, you asked before how I'm doing, and I'm feeling. What's going to say, it's going to have the wrong connotation, but not in a negative way, but obligated to do something and to be more vocal in different ways than I have in the past, and to do that with the humble recognition that that I have the ability and I think burden to do so, as a white man in this society, as a well, not that college professor is the highest status occupation in the world. We like to think of it as, but as a high status individual in that regard on a college campus who has a voice and has a platform, but also to do it in the right way, and to figure out what the right way is to do that. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not suggesting I have the right answer to that, but how you do that in a way that draws attention to the right things, that does so without. That makes it clear that you're doing so not to shine any sort of light on your own contributions or your own work, but on the issues that are important, and that does so with the humility to recognize that you're not always going to get that right, and that when you are called out as not getting that right or putting the emphasis in the wrong place, that, and this is not something that I or maybe many academics are good at, but putting ego aside and not dwelling on that and learning from that and moving forward and doing it in a better way, and that's. Again, I think those are sort of the issues that you are articulating for the presentations we've given, but that are sort of swimming around in my head as we think through all of this.
Yeah, and I think in very similar ways, right? I mean, again, trying to figure out a way to be a good and effective and authentic ally is really, really difficult. And there are lots of different ways. You're going to find evidence, again, referring to Mr. Patel's comments, you're going to find evidence for lots of different things. There's going to be potential backlash for those, but I don't think there's any one right way. I mean, I think what we have to do is we have to, as you said, try, make efforts, make mistakes, be willing to make those mistakes, be willing to listen and grow and change and develop. And I think, again, it's not, you're finding your voice isn't a destination, it's more of a journey, and it's going to change over time. And I think, we have to be responsive to the situation, but most importantly, Sam, just deciding and feeling the need and the urgency to get involved is going to be the most important thing. It's just that all of us have to find that place of getting on this highway, if you will.
Great. Thank you so much for the comments so far. I'm popping in to interrupt only because we have some really substantive and interesting questions. And I think one way to make the transition is you mentioned, I think it was in both cases, it was Keith mentioned, persuasive exercises or persuasive methods, being persuasive basically, and also in the interest of hacking the system, which is a complex system that includes cognitive bias as well as social bias. So we have two questions along those lines. And one of them is about, they're both about specific audiences. One is about small children. So we have a student wants to be an educator of kids, especially I think elementary kids. Wants to know how do you suggest talking to children about race, racism, and the current injustice in a way that they will understand, but that it also does not downplay the realities. So that's a big question. But I'll just throw out the other one so you can take them both on. The other one's police. So as the target or the audience. So one police department reform that's been proposed many times is anti-implicit bias training. Do you believe that this can play a role, and why or why not? So young people and police, we could start with those and say how we do.
The young people question is a good one, and neither Keith or I are developmental psychologists, but we have colleagues in our department as well as in child study and human development who could probably give you even better answers to those kinds of questions. But I mean, if we were to sort of go outside of our lane a little bit and sort of think through those issues, I mean, I do believe one of the major messages that is an important one. This is only focused on a small section of this question, but these are conversations that for a long time in our society have only happened in certain households and certain types quote unquote, of families. And I think they need to be happening in all families. And just to be very explicit, right? I mean, these are conversations that shouldn't just be conversations that are had in Black families, that are had in Latino families, that are had in Native families. These are conversations that all of us as Americans should be having. You know, white families, all families should be having conversations about these kinds of issues. Keith, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I say the same thing. I mean, I think, you know, again, in terms of having conversations with our kids, it's funny, it's come up in lots of different ways over the years, but I think ultimately and I don't, again, purport to have the right answers about this, but one thing would be sort of understanding the cognitive development of children over time. And so one question is, how old is the kid? If you understand that kids have a progression by which they're able to sort of access certain kinds of concepts, then the conversation or the metaphors that you use to try to explain the situation are going to differ depending on the age of the child. So for us, so Sam and I both have kids who are now in their teens. Early on, I would say that most of the conversations that we have about this is really, as a lot of work that Sam has sort of identified, is starting with just getting kids comfortable about talking about color and race and differences, and that a lot of work has sort of demonstrated that we tend to sort of endorse this idea of color blindness, and color blindness as being a progression or a way of moving forward of progress. And I think a lot of Sam's work has sort of demonstrated that that's not true, that it keeps us from talking about the factors that actually contribute to the disparities. They're the functioning mechanisms that lead to the disparities that we see in our households and in our societies. So if you take away color, if you take away race, if you take away the dimensions of group differences and categorizations, you take away the reasons, the explanation for the disparities that we see. So getting people comfortable identifying and talking about color early on, and color differences and race differences, it's okay. It's good to talk about those things and feel comfort. And I think what that does is it probably ameliorates any anxiety that kids might have later on when they start to see and hear these kinds of conversations. And I think for parents, that's when you can start to, to titrate and, start to increase a little bit more of the information that you get about sort of what's happening in society, the ways in which race and other groups, dimensions of group difference play a role in people's outcomes. So yeah, I think it's just important to sort of know what level they're at, and then once you know what level they're at, you have to target your communication to be, consistent with what they can grasp at that point.
Nice.
On the policing front, yeah. I think that it's very clear that there is no evidence that suggests that simply checking the box and having your police department sign up for a quote unquote, implicit bias or unconscious bias workshop training, that you're good to go. And the same for corporations and other organizations, but we're focused on the police here specifically. So there's no evidence that that's sufficient. Keith and I have done workshops with the university police and talked through some of these issues. But again, we're talking here about the need for real structural conversations about not just at an individual level, how we see each other, interact with each other, but just how the system itself is set up, and how the structure of these interactions with the society and with civilians are taking place. And so, we'd suggest, if you're interested, there are organizations you can look up. There's the Center for Policing Equity that Phil Goff and others, Phil's at the John Jay College right now, but that Phil and others have put together, and they're proposing, as others are, a variety of different remedies and strategies that include good data. So we have data to suggest what's actually happening in police-civilian interactions, with arrests, with stops, with use of force, and so forth, and real commitment at a top-down leadership level to making these issues first and foremost in the institution. And so it's an open question still. If we knew how to quote unquote solve, just like that, the problem of bias policing, or any of the kinds of biases we're talking about, we wouldn't hold out. We would let everyone know. But it's a very complicated system in place that's both individual and structural and everything in between. And so I think we're still trying to think through all of those issues, and a lot of really bright and motivated folks have been spending a lot of time of late doing that kind of work.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I think I probably should wind us down, but let me say this: Professor Maddox, Professor Sommers teach regularly, publish a lot, write in scholarly ways and in more accessible ways, or both scholarly ways that are accessible. So for those who are new to the Tufts community, you should learn from them. you have a lot of opportunities to learn from them. You can start learning from them later this afternoon when you get on your computer, or you can take their class. And I think, this conversation as inevitably just scratched the surface or just really began. So I feel bad about moving us on, but we got to do that. But thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to join in and just, profound thanks to you, Sam and Keith, for joining us today. It was so valuable. So appreciate both of you and really grateful for you just being wonderful colleagues. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So everyone, we're going to shift a little bit now. And I guess as we shift to focus on mindfulness and looking at how mindfulness is a practice that we invite you to explore as a way to both intrapersonally and for you to reduce stress. Mindfulness is also a practice that where there has been a lot of research that shows it is a practice that can help us to reduce bias, to develop our social and emotional stamina, which we talked about last week. So I'll just give everyone 15 seconds to read the first paragraph that's up on the screen. And then I'll read the second paragraph for those who can't see the screen. It's the second paragraph that I think is really wonderful to use right now as a bridge to our next speaker. And this paragraph reads, this all suggests that mindfulness and compassion practices may be important to creating the general conditions that support minimizing bias. And this is a quote by Rhonda Maggie, who wrote the book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. And I'm reminded of the quote that Eboo mentioned at the end of his talk, the quote by William Blake, and we are put on this earth a little space that we might learn to bear the beams of love. And so with that, I turn to introduction to Jessie Samadhi, and I'm so grateful that you're here with us today, Jessie. Jessie is the lead mindfulness instructor for the Student Athlete Mindfulness Program at Tufts. She is also a new graduate of the master's degree program at the Elliott Pearson Child Study Human Development Program. So congratulations, Jessie, on just completing your master's degree. She's an applied researcher at the Judge Baker Children's Center in the Center for Effective Child Therapy. She's also a research assistant in the Child Health Equity Research Lab at Tufts and a crisis counselor at Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. So without further ado, Jessie, begin, and I'll come on when we have a few minutes left just to wrap up and say goodbye, and then give closure to this session. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. It's been really, a privilege to be a part of the panel with such wonderful and mindful, for lack of a different word, panel. So and speakers. So I'm just really grateful to be able to share with you a spotlight on mindfulness. And I'm just going to share a couple of slides with you before I lead you in a practice. And so just like Deborah said, I recently graduated from Tufts. And through my time at Tufts, I have been really involved in mindfulness, and specifically been connected with Deborah through a mindfulness committee and a task force that came together amidst, the COVID-19 pandemic and also the pandemic of racism, in learning the best ways that we can support the Tufts community. And so we're really coming together and trying to offer different resources and ways to have these more challenging and heavy conversations that are so integral. And as Keith noted, I really loved the variety of metaphors, but what really stood out to me was this idea that we're getting on this highway of change. And in order to find our voice, it's not necessarily a destination, but a journey. And I think that I highlight that because I believe that mindfulness is something that can really support this process. And so when we think of mindfulness, we're bringing this into the webinar series because we are living in uncertain and unprecedented times. And specifically, mindfulness has been found to be effective for managing these challenging emotions, thoughts, you name it. And it also creates a space for having both unpleasant and pleasant thoughts and emotions to emerge and be vulnerable with ourselves and with others while creating community. And I wanted to highlight these three tenets or elements of mindfulness being common humanity, present awareness, and compassion. And so mindfulness is rooted in, the beginnings of the Buddhist religion, but Jon Kabat-Zinn brought it to us in a more secular form, in a way for us to really just be able to take a step back. And so that present awareness is being with the moment, sitting with pleasant and unpleasant thoughts, emotions, spaces, to really bring us to that common humanity, to bring us to that idea that we are one, but we are also individuals, that connectedness. And I really think what I want to highlight about that common humanity is the vulnerability and the imperfection. So being able to sit with both of those. And finally, that third element is compassion. And so compassion, sounds so lovely, and yet at the root of it, it is literally meant to suffer with. And I think this really connects to both present awareness and common humanity, because we're suffering with one another. This is not to say that we have experienced similar things, but it's to say that we can have that compassion, that kindness, that awareness for self and for other. So it's this idea of a common suffering. And I think it's really great to come back to these, especially because as Keith and Sam were mentioning, when they were talking about their, what they are going through and how they're feeling currently, how this is going to bring up, this undulation or this roller coaster of emotions. And so being able to hold sustainability with this is where mindfulness really comes in. And I'll just go ahead and give you kind of a more intentional definition of mindfulness, which is having the intention to pay attention to your immediate experience without judgment. And I have a quote here for you as well that kind of highlights Jon Kabat-Zinn, as I referenced before, that I note the non-judgment. And that's a big part of mindfulness. And what I really want to highlight here is that non-judgment doesn't mean that we're not going to have judgments necessarily, but rather that we're aware of them. And I'm going to circle back again to Keith and Sam, because I was really feeling connected with a lot of what they were saying and how that related to mindfulness. And I think it was Keith specifically who said, we have these cognitive processes and we have these shortcuts that we take. And it's important that we understand more about the process and the mechanism. And I offer that is, one of the ways in which we can connect to non-judgment or the awareness of judgment. And this is what really creates or allows for the creation of change, improvement, and development. So the reason I bring this up is because it's important that we learn to manage our thoughts and emotions in all aspects of our lives. So be that academically, personally, professionally, socially, and civically. And so the ultimate question is, how do you do it, right? And so I love this kind of cycle because I think it breaks down the physiological in a really simple way, a really understandable way. The idea that, you know, there are such great benefits to just breathing. And so mindfulness, I think, often gets this rap of, you know, you're picturing someone on a mountain who's so serene and pleasant, and yet in a world where, or a situation where things often feel out of our control, coming back to the breath as something that we can control can really help that space between stimulus and response. So thinking about mindfulness, it creates this connection between the mind, the body, and the brain. So we can regulate our breath, and this regulates our body and our nervous system and our brain, and really helps us to take a step back and think about how we want to intentionally and actively respond. And so breathing specifically actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system. I won't claim to be an expert on this, but I will say this is the calming part of your autonomic nervous system, and this calms or quiets the fight, flight, and freeze system. And this is why we highlight this, because research has really shown the benefits of it. And so I'm happy that I can now bring you into a short breathing practice that can just help us to ground and center with the topics that have come up today, with any heaviness you might be feeling, any pleasantness you may be feeling as well, and also just cultivating a space for that, for you to hold this. That being said, I will use the sound of a bell. I want to offer that as just an alert. I'm going to use the sound of a bell to let you know when we will end the practice. And I will also offer that you can close your eyes in this practice. I know that can be triggering for some people. And so I just let you know that, so that you can take care of yourself if that is not something that feels good to you right now. So without taking any more time, just allow yourself to settle into a comfortable meditation position. And just very kindly and very gently allowing your eyes to close, or if that doesn't feel comfortable, just softly placing a gaze in front of you. And just allowing yourself to leave behind anything that no longer serves you. Coming to your natural breath, to the natural rhythm. And just acknowledging the space that you're in. Acknowledging any comfort, maybe discomfort, warmth, chill, maybe a feeling of being just right. Allowing your breath to be an anchor for you during this practice. Noticing the breath that brought you here and continues to feed you. And really acknowledging the privilege of breath. The inhale and the exhale. How are you arriving into this space? Are you able to be present with yourself, with your thoughts, with your emotions? Breathing in to calm the body. And breathing out to free the mind. And if your mind wanders, just becoming aware of that and coming back to your anchor, your breath. And with a deep and gentle breath in, bringing awareness to your being and the physical space you're in, and listening for the sound of the bell to softly open your eyes when you feel ready. So thank you all for sitting with me through that. And I just wanted to share that I will also offer some resources in case this has been a helpful practice for you or it's something you want to continue to try. These are resources that I will have shared with Deborah and Peter so that they can be on the Canvas page. And I also just want to highlight that there are a variety here that are specifically for Black and Indigenous people of color. And it's really, really wonderful that we're just having the opportunity to access all of these resources for free or with a trial period. So I will share these so that you can access them. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was beautiful. Thank you. And those resources will be available on Canvas, and there's a whole page with mindfulness resources and some videos, and we'll be posting more in the coming days. So we're over time, so I'll just take a moment to give everyone a heads up for next week. First, I just want to say I'm so grateful that you've all been with us today, and grateful for all who will be watching this recorded session later. And next week, we have Dina Simmons will be joining us. Dina was actually on the cover of Mindful magazine about a year ago. She's the assistant director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And she'll be leading us in more of a workshop during the first hour. So we will have some breakout sessions. And we'll post more information about this on the Canvas site, because there are some readings that we will encourage all of you to take a look at before next week's session. And then also, before we close, want to bring to your attention, for those who haven't seen the email from President Monaco, that this coming Friday, Tufts, the entire university, is going to be pausing and focusing on a day of reflection, commitment, and action for racial justice. So on June 19th, known in the Black community as Juneteenth, commemorating the end of slavery in the US, it's especially important this year, in this time, with these pandemics, to take this time and to pause and to, as Keith said, to find our ways onto the highway of social change. So we hope that we'll see many of you there. There will be workshops from 10 to 11, 11 to 12. It starts at 9, and the whole session will end at 1. So we thank you again so much for being with us here today. And we look forward to connecting with you on Canvas asynchronously, and then seeing you all again next week on Wednesday. Thank you so much.